welcome back to Aether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kalyan and a guest who we have hoped to have on the show for a long time, someone whose channel and content I've followed for years at this point, David Patrick Harry of Church of the Eternal Logos. We're going to be having a great conversation today about all sorts of topics. You know, there's been some big breaking news things. He's been covering it on his channel as well. Of course, we had our last show about the attempted Trump assassination. We're going to be talking about magic, the occult, some of the prophecies in World War III, because he's one of the few people that's also really dug into this and is trying to, spread the word of Metropolitan Neophytos and these other people. So it's an honor to have him on. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us here on Aether Hour.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's really a fantastic, collaboration here. The World War Now extended universe continues to expand. And yeah, I think we're going to have a great conversation. Dimitri, I know we've been prepping for this and we're ready to talk a bit about, your wheelhouse, which I know we came to Orthodoxy actually at very similar times. I remember during COVID and everything, and we're also a fan of Seraphim Rose and come from a background involved in more of the psychedelic New Age sphere of things. And Father Seraphim Rose, of course, had a very strong influence on my conversion to Orthodoxy. So if you want to maybe tell the people a little bit about your background who may not be fully aware of your channel and your content, which of course will all be linked below, feel free to go as long as you would like.
All right. Well, my name's David Patrick Harry. I'm a PhD candidate, and I am getting my PhD in religious studies, and my fields are within new religious movements and the Western esoteric tradition. So very small sort of niche fields, and my research focuses on transhumanism. Obviously, most people wouldn't suspect that relates to new religious movements or Western esoteric traditions or related to magic, but my dissertation is making the claim that in fact it does, and looking at the ways in which deification are viewed from a theosis orthodox perspective compared to the transhumanist cyborg understanding of immortality and omniscience and all this different stuff. So my YouTube channel is Church of the Eternal Logos, and really what I do there is just use the Orthodox phronema and Orthodox worldview to talk about a variety of different topics. It could be manosphere, red pill content. It could be Orthodox saints, lives of the saints, theology. Could be obviously things related to the occult, Western esotericism, or whatever the latest happening in culture may be. So I cover a wide range of topics. So that's kind of what I do. If you want to check out some of the content I make, just go to YouTube, Church of the Eternal Logos, or whatever podcast system that you may have access to. They should be available there.
No, it's a very fascinating background, and I'm glad that we have people that are, in this sphere of things, as you could say, not infiltrating, but, engaging at the highest levels of academia and actually, getting the credentials that we know the world, they won't take you seriously unless you've got the PhD behind your name. So,
Right.
we're getting there, and now we're going to have one of our own. But yeah, I
Yeah, it's
think I want to.
unfortunate though, the academy, I mean, the PhD just it doesn't mean what I think it used to mean.
Mhm.
And being in higher education and graduate school, you realize that PhDs do give you real skills in regards to the ability to research and decipher, but the quality of scholarship is so poor, especially in the liberal arts, that the most cited source in all of liberal arts is Michel Foucault, who was a homosexual pedophile who died from AIDS that he contracted through bathhouses in San Francisco as a visiting professor at UC Berkeley. And so that's one of the things that, for more normie, even boomer type people, the PhD means a lot. And me getting ready to finish, God willing, I see the other types of scholars that are getting their credentialed PhDs, and it kind of makes me roll my eyes.
No, I'm sure it makes people who actually are doing really deep and good work feel as if, they're getting a bit gypped. But yeah, I mean, I went to college, we've seen the inside of the beast here, but I think I want to dive into one of the things that I probably find the most interesting about your content. And this is from years ago. One of my favorite videos that you ever made is about the wizard archetype. You mentioned the occult and Western esotericism. And on our show, I do a lot of talking about things like sigil charging, magic, these sort of issues that people might see. What does this have to do with geopolitics? But as somebody who does believe in metaphysics, as somebody who believes in the spiritual reality, who believes in sort of the powers and principalities of the aerial realm, I think it's important for people to realize that there is always going to be a sort of a spiritual angle to a lot of these things that we talk about when it comes to world events even, or even the reality of something like witches, wizards, the actual occult you might see in horror movies and these other things. So at a fundamental basic level, perhaps in the interest of educating my audience who hasn't watched as much of your content as I have, and I might be utilizing language I've picked up from your videos in the past at a basic level, and then perhaps getting more complex, what is magic? Like what like I know people think of Harry Potter that someone says a word and then like electricity comes out of your wand or whatever. Like what actually
Right.
is magic?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. So magic, to give more of a just a definitional approach, has to do with the manifestation of one's will. And obviously, a more recent iteration of magical practice would be somebody like Aleister Crowley, and he developed the tradition known as Thelema. And Thelema is just a Greek word for will. And so magic throughout history, and this is, whether it be primitive tribes or Neoplatonic theurgic practices, the Hermetic corpus, various pagan traditions, it's about the understanding that one, there is a spiritual reality, and that man can manipulate the world through will by utilizing symbols. Could be language. I mean, you mentioned sigils, which are again visual representations of an idea. I can speak a little bit about what a sigil is and how you construct one. But magic is about correspondential relationships, sympathetic magic, sympathetic relationships. So we all have heard of like a voodoo doll. Well, a voodoo doll works because it has the hair of the person that you're trying to attack. It has a piece of their clothing. It has various things that connect them back to the person. And so magic is built on this worldview that things have correspondential, sympathetic relationships, like affects like. And this was discussed at an academic level. The first person to really articulate it was Fraser, James George Fraser, in his book, The Golden Bough. And he talks about correspondential understandings. And from an academic, from a more secular perspective, they believe that magic was the first, like the primitive understanding of causation. And so, because the shaman or the witch or whatever contextual cultural setting they're in, that they would be able to recite certain words, poetry. I mean, when you look into like the Celtic tradition, the bard is another form of the magician. And so it's utilizing the self-expression to manipulate the world. And then if you're into magic, they divide magic up into white magic, gray magic, and black magic. And white magic is about you utilizing your will to quote unquote benefit others. Obviously, as Orthodox Christians, all this stuff is evil and we shouldn't participate in it. But black magic is specifically about utilizing your will to influence other people's wills or cause harm to somebody else. And that's how they divide magical practices. Like if you're just trying to manifest your will and you're not hurting anybody, well, this is white magic. This is beneficent magic. And so the reason why, as an Orthodox Christian, many people would say, well, you guys believe in magic, you take the Eucharist and all this different stuff, but at a definitional level, it has to do with will. And so we are not performing rituals for the manifestation of our own will. And by definition, it's not magic. And we, as Christians, our goal is to try to align our human will, our personal will, with God's will. And this is the whole point of theosis, and this is the way in which we're divinized by engagement in the uncreated energies. And magic is really about utilizing these energies for essentially the worship of one's own desires. So many people might think this is superstitious or antiquated, but as we get through the conversation, I'm sure it will become more apparent that magic is actually surrounding us in every day. Propaganda, news, the mental landscape is the battlefield. And Orthodoxy speaks about this, the logismy, right? So mental images is in the way in which demons attack us. Well, the magician is trying to alter the mental landscape in which you operate so that whether you're utilizing your free will or not, you're going to come to conclusions that are in relationship to their desired goals. So, all types of things in our culture, I would say, have a magical bent. For example, during COVID, the utilization of these face masks, which we all knew do not protect from a virus, the particles are so much smaller that it has no efficacious benefit on the person wearing it. But if you're familiar with magic rituals of initiation, there's always utilization of masks because masks are used to symbolize the transition of one's identity. And I really believe that COVID and the utilization of all these surgical masks was the transition of people's identity to submission to the system itself. Whether they're conscious of that or not doesn't really matter. But the effect of getting people to believe something and act in accordance with something that really defies logic and reason, the only thing that I would argue that makes sense is that people are really under a sort of magic spell. And that's what, Aleister Crowley talked about, that magic and spells go together. So spelling words, manipulation of symbols, manipulation of expression. This is the point. So grimoire is really just another word for grammar. And when we look at, you use the example of Harry Potter, the magic wand, when Harry goes and gets his first wand that his parents left him, it's made of holly from the holly tree. And that would be wood from the holly tree is obviously Hollywood. And this is in the Druidic tradition was always believed to be the most magical and powerful magic wand. And so I would make a connection there that Hollywood itself, the production of films and whatnot, that really is a magic wand. The intention of it is to manipulate people's perceptions of reality. And so
Movie
if
magic.
exactly, and if you believe in God, reality has a direct correlation to his act of creation. And so magic is really about getting people, the black magician who's affecting the minds of individuals is getting people to perceive and act in accordance with a quote unquote reality that really isn't ultimate reality. And so they live in a fantasy world. And this is, I would say, what's happening all around our society in multiple ways.
No, I think that's incredibly relevant, and I think most of us even see small profane versions of magic in everyday life, and perhaps, any Christians that are listening are not really actively participating in these things. And of course, we're clearly talking about things such as, which, they in a way overlap with paganism in some form, right? So you have zodiac, astrology, fortune telling,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sort of going to sort of wise men outside of the church, wise, not wise rabbis or wise teachers, but, in a way like going to various carnivals, trying to see a glimpse into the future. And especially at the beginning of the 20th century, spiritism and the invocation of spirits in like a very, in a way, very light-hearted, sort of seemingly harmless way was very popular amongst even the elites and middle classes of society. It was just very common to call up a sort of this, secular 19th century sorcerer, and he would like conjure up the spirit of your dead grandmother to speak about her will and estate, which sounds ridiculous, but I mean, that's what people began sort of believing in and began even apostatizing from Christianity by participating in these events. I mean, one of the most popular sort of black magicians at the time in Russian imperial society was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the assassins of Rasputin, actually, who had his own so-called black room in London where whenever he would visit the UK, he would go to this apartment and do certain rituals. His black robes actually are still in one of the British museums. So even certain elites of Russian society, sort of so-called Orthodox Christians, they would apostatize and begin, participating in these sort of things. And this is when people can really appreciate that magic is an actual a dark force, an element of sinful practice in our view. It's not simple paganism. It's not just the burning up of incense on the pyre before a pagan statue, right? It's not essentially equivalent to what we read about in the lives of the martyrs, especially in the first centuries. It seems that the veneration of idols, Patrick, and magic is essentially they're somewhat related, right? Because again, demonic powers are here and about in this particular realm, but magic seems to be much worse. The penances in the writings of the saints seem to be a lot worse for magic. It's almost equivalent to manslaughter, murder, homosexuality. It is a literal crime, and in a lot of places, like in the Russian Tsardom and the Byzantine Empire, magic was like a literal crime in the criminal codex, right? You couldn't actually perform magic legally speaking. Like it was equivalent to adultery,
Right.
to stealing, to rape. So,
Mm-hmm.
so people actually understood it as a real factor in human life. And for some reason, Patrick, we do see this trend, right? And I wanted to ask you about it. And perhaps maybe folks have understood this from the Alex Jones podcasts with Joe Rogan when he began speaking about the elites using magic and rituals very, very seriously in his own like Alex Jonesian way. And people were like, hold on, what are you talking about? And then he began to bring up Bohemian Grove, and we begin realizing that the elites actually have carried over this so-called secret magical practice from ancient pagan pre-Christian times on into our modern so-called atheistic reality. And some of those practices really haven't gone away. They've just gone underground in many ways. And
Right.
so perhaps you could speak about that magic, unfortunately, and it's still carried over into today's day and age, and even our so-called Western Christian culture still has this underlying undercurrent of elite occultism, which we see in movies a lot of the time, but it's a reality that we live in today, essentially under this sort of bewitched state, unknowing what the powers that be are doing to us.
Right. No, I agree. And magic essentially is about power, and so it makes sense why the people who are in the most powerful positions or trying to attain the most powerful positions in our society would utilize these ancient theurgic techniques. And theurgy, for those listening who maybe have never heard of that term, is a term utilized in religious studies to describe the idea that you can perform rituals and command God to act. So that man has a unique disposition where when he performs a certain ritual, he forces this spiritual domain or God to act. And this is what the wizard is. The wizard is this medium point between this ambiguous God. Certainly, it's not the Trinity, whatever God that they deem to be who they're worshiping, and that they can perform these sympathetic correspondential rituals that commands God to act. And so, let's explain a little bit about like what a sigil is, because if we're going to be talking about the global elite and people in very powerful positions, it's useful to just understand a very rudimentary understanding of like how a magic symbol is manifested. And so a sigil, for example, and there's a whole form of magic called sigil magic, which is about the manifestation of symbols that within that symbol is embedded an entire willful desire. So, say you wanted to perform a ritual, a sigil ritual, in which you attained 2,000 extra dollars at the end of the month. So, something that is beyond the normal occurrences, but something that's not totally outlandish. Not like you're asking for millions of dollars to become king of the world. You want 2,000 extra dollars. So, you could write on a piece of paper, "It is my highest desire to have $2,000 by the end of the month." And then you write that out, and you cross out all the vowels, because vowels have no they're just phonetic. They actually don't contain meaning, and this is one of the reasons why you can read words without vowels. The brain still connects
Mm.
the meaning of the words because meaning is contained in the consonants. Then you have a series of consonants, and then you mark out all the ones that repeat. So maybe you have 12 to 20 letters, and now you begin to take those letters and you manipulate them, and you write them on a paper, and you write them on top of each other. Well, pretty soon you've created a symbol that in no way represents visually the desire that you just wrote down. So this is a semiotic manipulation. Again, magic is always about the manipulation of symbols. And we can connect this later in regards to the theology of the logos, the word, the expression of God, and how it's taking the spiritual reality and it's flipping it. And so the sigil then can be some abstract symbol that is really you've taken a non-physical desire, so it existed nowhere in the physical space, and then you've written it down and you've put it into two dimensions by creating a symbol with it. So now you've taken the desire and you've manifested it physically to some degree, and then you can charge it. And the way that you charge it, there's various techniques. You can, like the book The Secret that Oprah spread in the early 2000s, you can put it in different places of your house, or maybe it's not totally visible, so it affects you at an unconscious level. Maybe you put it on like your dream board where you stare at it every single day and you visualize about whatever that desire is. Or you can use sexual energy. And so your mention about adultery and sex, and we'll get into that and how this relates. And so you can masturbate or you can have sex, and during the state of orgasm, you want to stare at the sigil. You want to stare at the symbol. Another way to charge it is to get a lot of people to look at it. And this is where you can make strong arguments that a lot of major corporations and logos are in fact sigils. And the
Yes.
way that they're being charged is that people are looking at them. And now once you've looked at the symbol, although it's exterior, it's outside of you. Once you've looked at it and you've tried to comprehend it, you've now brought it into yourself. And so this is another way to charge symbols, charge sigils. And the idea is that you can then manifest whatever it is that you wanted. And before I became Orthodox, and while I was again studying during my master's degree, which was focused on like early Christianity and psychedelic shamanism, those were the things that I was focusing on. I attempted to do sigil magic just with the example that we just mentioned, and it happened. I attained the thing that I wanted, and it came through like strange circumstances. Somebody donated a bunch of money. It's just, it can be any way. It's not like it just manifests at your doorstep. It utilizes your lived experience, your lived reality, and avenues in which this intention can manifest itself. And after that happened, I was kind of startled. One, that it worked, and two, what does that mean? And then, again, I was a non-believer. I was non-Christian. I grew up like in a conservative Methodist home. And by the time I got to college and realized so many of the things that I was taught about scripture or the Bible seemed to be fallacious, I kind of lost my faith, got interested in Eastern mysticism, spent 2 summers in China, studied Mandarin Chinese, and was really interested in magic, the utilization of psychedelics, and Eastern mystical practices. And looking further into this, after I attained the thing that I wanted, I began to understand that when you perform these rituals, there's always a give and a take. And so you can get what it is that you want, but something will be also taken from you, or something will happen in exchange for the thing that you've acquired.
Mm.
And that then, so the following month, I got really sick, stuff like this. And that's what caused me to look further into this. And that's where it, like, really opened my eyes on the reality of this stuff. And magic, you're talking about adultery and that it legally was outlawed. This is because magic is about the dissolution of boundaries. And I've spoke about psychedelics and how they dissolve boundaries, and John Hopkins studies in regards to it aiding people with PTSD. And I don't discount that psychedelics do that, but psychedelics dissolve boundaries. That's what they do. So if you have a cognitive boundary based on a traumatic experience, you take psychedelic substances, and obviously it can help dissolve that boundary so that you can overcome that trauma. But by doing that, it's also dissolving the boundary between our physical existence and the spiritual realm. It's dissolving the boundaries between the perception of your own personhood and another person. So the idea that, like, we're all one, we're all the same person, or I'm trying to realize that I'm the universe. This is about a radical dissolution of boundaries themselves. And so magic is about not having boundaries, especially in the contemporary period after Aleister Crowley, because any sort of boundary is a hindrance to one's power. So Aleister Crowley, for example, was adamant that a great magician has to be sodomized and also sodomize another man. And the reason being that if you had a boundary that you would not allow that to happen, that was considered a weakness. That was considered a limitation to your power. And so if there's nothing that you can't do, well, then you're empowered. And in fact, during my coursework, during my PhD studies, we had a transgender theistic Satanist that was there in the class. She was a master's student, although she identified as a man, and she had a girlfriend, and she identified as a trans man lesbian, which is, again, is a conflation of definitions. If you're a trans man and you're into women, well, technically, based on your own standards, you would be heterosexual, but she didn't identify that way. And in fact, we can already see the magical dissolution of and contradiction to logic and reason itself. As Orthodox Christians, we believe these are uncreated energies of God. So the magical enterprise is actually pushing up against these things and causing a sort of mental confusion, but it's really a manifestation and a recreating of reality in your own will. So we know that a man can't give birth or a man can't have a period, but the fact that so many people will actually confront you and say, men can menstruate, this is a definitional destruction. This is a dissolution of cognitive boundaries. And this particular person, this trans theistic Satanist, she was a priestess, or she would refer to herself as a priest, of a theistic temple in the Bay Area. And so they performed conjuration rituals. And the way that she described in class, by the way, she described this to the class, that when they perform their rituals, it's sort of a mocked, inverted Catholic Mass. And so a lot of satanic rituals will utilize Catholicism and invert it in various ways. And so they have like a wafer, and they'll put menstrual blood, fecal matter, that type of stuff on the wafer, and the people within the temple will consume it. And the idea is that they're empowered by it, because most people would be so disgusted and horrified by such a thing, they wouldn't engage with it. But that moral limitation is perceived as a weakness. And so that what they're doing ritualistically is they are transgressing all the boundaries to show that there's nothing that limits them. And those that are limited are, in a sense, in the darkness. This is related to, again, Luciferianism or Promethean form of spirituality, where it's about the light bringer, right? So you acquire the light, you acquire the ability to transgress these boundaries, while the other people are sort of in the darkness. And that's just again a rudimentary example of what these practices are doing and how people are engaging in them. So when we look at our society and we look at the transgression of moral boundaries, cognitive boundaries, definitional boundaries, this is really, in my argumentation, would be a form of magical ritual. And that what's happening is it's causing mental confusion. People are literally reacting to the world based on a mental landscape that doesn't really match on to reality. And this is all done through propaganda, through symbols, through language, through ideas, right? All these things that are essentially non-physical, because it's all happening in the mind. And the mind, in a sense, really does influence reality. I'm not here to support The Secret or something like that, but based on magical practices, that's exactly what's happening.
You're kind of touching on almost the heart of our whole show here. It's called Aether Hour. I repeat a lot the idea. People say, the ether is tearing. That's kind of what you mentioned, these boundaries being broken down, psychedelics or these magical rituals. It's pulling the layers back from, our current state in the physical realm and giving us a bit of a glimpse, frankly, a glimpse we are not supposed to have quite yet of the reality going on, you could say, behind the curtain, behind the metaphysical curtain, going on in, the true aerial realm of the spiritual, where the demons and the angels are I guess visible, you could say. And I think you talk about the will and how these people, they will transgress, the moral bound. It's like it's all it's all encompassing in its categories. It's about moral boundaries. It's in some cases about physical boundaries. You could talk about borders and political mixing up of nations and all these sorts of things. It's an entire, it's the forcible pushing of the many into the one, as opposed to the, Christian understanding that harmonizes those two. That's apparent, I
Right.
guess, dialectic. But I guess to maybe ground some of this in some recent discussions, you recently had a huge stream about the attempted assassination on Trump. I think this is a good transition into, World War III, perhaps, and some prophecies, which is some stuff that we all share in common. Obviously, we're seeing what some might describe as an insane release of memetic energy, perhaps you just talked about corporations and their, I guess, desire to charge sigils to conduct some of this more large-scale magic. I think people are finally starting to understand the scale of what I really mean when I say things like the alchemical transmutation of the world mind or the collective unconscious or anything else, that the powers that be have attempted to foist upon the world with these, I guess you could say, scaled up to a larger level rituals, like the one that you described, where you got more money at the end of the month. They're scaling that out to a larger population with more grandiose goals, which therefore would require more energy, I guess you could say. And if what we're seeing right now, I'm just my mind is everywhere with the potential for large scale sigil charging. Obviously, we see how, just at a basic memetic level, Trump is being rocketed to, he's already basically the assumed president at this point, after these iconic images and this assassination attempt, on top of all of the lawfare and everything. I'm wondering, when it comes to politics, in an American context, in a worldwide context, how important are, I guess, some of these magical ideas at both a basic human psychological level and, you could say, I guess, at a higher conspiratorial level? Because if you're talking about some girl in your college class that's getting up in front of everybody and talking about eating poop crackers and doing horrible, disgusting, weird rituals that I think anybody would actually be embarrassed to do, imagine what these people at the highest echelons of society that are willing to be doing secret things, that might be interested in this level of magic and controlling and executing of their own will. I think that's a bit of a tell into what could really be going on at the top. So maybe let me know what you're thinking about all of that, because I know that when it comes to memetics, everybody knows that 2016 was the meme election. And I think since then, you hear people talk about the plague of frogs and Pepe and that stuff. We really did enter a sort of new memetic age when all of that went down, and it's only getting crazier.
Yeah. So, in 2016, there was actually an academic that's in the field of Western esoteric traditions. He's not a Christian by any means, but I believe he's in the Netherlands. And he wrote a whole academic article on memetic magic, where he documents the war, the memetic war between various factions of like the Hermetic Golden Dawn, these magical organizations, and that there's a right wing and a left wing bent, and they are very polarized. And so those that are more of the white nationalist, pagan, magical route were filling memes with what they believe to be a sort of sigil memetic magic to influence the masses. And the left was doing the exact same thing. So mimetics, again, if magic is related to semiotics and the manipulation of symbols and the manipulation of mind, that would obviously go hand in hand. And I assume that many people listening to this podcast are familiar with theories of adrenochrome and child sacrifice and pedophilia. And one of the reasons in these more dark, black magical practices is the destruction of innocence, the destruction of purity is one of the biggest catalysts for magical energy, right? So if everything's a give and a take, then what do you give to get the thing that you want to take? And obviously sacrificing children or, sexually assaulting them, which is going to scar them in a significant way. This is not uncommon, and that's part of the ancient lores, at least within the Middle Ages, of witchcraft. And witches, it was very common for them to participate in like orgies. If you wanted an abortion, you would go and find a witch, so they would know which type of herbs for you to take to abort the baby, this type of thing. So concerning like contemporary politics, I think it's all a war of mimetics. And certainly Trump has many flaws. As an Orthodox Christian, there's many things that I would disagree with. But when we're looking at evil, typically it's always associated with fear. And so when you look at the rhetoric that the general left has described with, white Christians, masculine men, more nationalist bents in regards to politics, this is a form of mimetic warfare. And we obviously recently witnessed the assassination attempt of Trump. And there's serious questions in regards to how the guy was able to pull it off. We saw about an hour before I streamed last night, there was breaking news that a police officer had spotted the man on the roof 30 minutes before shots were fired, that a police officer apparently crawled up the ladder. There was a permanent ladder behind the building that they, for some reason, didn't have blocked off. And he saw the man, he pointed his rifle at him, and then he drops down. So I think there's at best, it was massive incompetence, but what seems more logical is that there was somebody was allowing it to happen to some degree. We've been told that one of the snipers had the guy in his sights for like 3 minutes and never took a shot. But my point and how I'm going to connect that back to the influence of magic in the world is the intention of the shooter himself. So there's been many speculate, he had both of his parents are behavioral psychologists, which is very interesting. He was a bit of a loner, according to people that went to high school with him. He was picked on. He was actually rejected from the rifle club at his high school for being such a poor shot. They deemed him to be too dangerous. But whatever the circumstances or the case is, where magic plays in is, again, manipulating the will of the individual. So I don't think it's the natural inclination of somebody to try to assassinate somebody else. But through mimetic forces, through rhetoric, again, the rhetoric that he's Hitler 2.0, this type of thing, it is influencing a larger will of somebody else who has a larger intention, let's say, for all intents and purposes, the globalist or the global elite or whoever's really in control. They are taking their desire and then manifesting that through rhetoric, memes, through language, symbols. Again, the correspondential relationship between Trump and Hitler, right? That's why that's so important, because you've already created a category of how people are supposed to perceive Hitler, and then you draw that connection. And so anything that happens where you can draw a correspondential relationship, that is affecting people's minds, whether they're conscious of it or not. And so I would argue that it is a sort of magical influence to get people willing to participate in such practices. And our political sphere is filled with this type of thing. And I would argue that the more that this demonic magical practice influences people, they become more and more like NPCs. And so this is really, again, a war about will, free will. And when we look at 2020, and that's where the meme of the NPC really got going, although it was already prominent in the 16 through 20 before Biden got elected. But after 2020, we see the people that will just parrot everything that they're told. And this is really a lack of critical thinking, which is a destruction of the image of God within us. And this is creating essentially what I've said on stream, that the NPC is a foot soldier of Satan. Because what they're doing is, and what these ideas and this influence is doing, is destroying the image of God within man, which is ultimately the spiritual goal of demons and Satan himself, is so that we end up in the same place that they're already damned to. And people are willing to submit to the authority of the state. Again, it's all about power. And this is part of the postmodern turn in academia, is obviously metaphysics have been questioned since Kant. And this has brought in the idea that really we're just living inside of our heads. This is, again, Hegelian dialectic philosophy, the idea that the full spirit's manifesting itself through this dialectical process of us observing reality, all this stuff. I'm not going to get into Hegelianism. But my point is academia, because metaphysics was destroyed essentially after Kant, it broke into idealism, which believes if we want to understand reality, where do we look? And because Kant criticized the idea that the external reality is fully knowable, this is one of the presuppositions of a Christian worldview, is that God created the world, we're created in the image of God, and that we can come to truth claims based on exterior observation. I'm not promoting natural theology or anything like this, but this is the understanding of how we relate back to creation. After Kant, he calls all this into question and says basically all these Aristotelian categories of causation, quantity, quality, all this different stuff, these are only mental categories. And what's happening is when we observe the world, we really don't know what's out there. It's a synthetic meshing between reality and our mental categories. And that broke academia into idealism, which is essentially what's called continental philosophy, where what we observe is lived experience. So phenomenology becomes the essential methodology in which we come to know the world. You observe how you experience things. That's the ultimate thing you can know, because you can't really know anything out in the world. And then the Anglo-American tradition went towards the direction of like logical positivism or British empiricism. And this is the idea that what's ever happening inside your head doesn't really matter. The only thing that exists is actually the exterior. And once logical positivism collapsed with Bertrand Russell and various people who highlighted that the founding principle of logical positivism isn't found through empiricism, and right, this is an apologetic attack you can have on somebody who's a secular empiricist or believes in science, but empiricism is a presuppositional starting point that empiricism itself can't prove. And so once that was demonstrated in the early 20th century, philosophy, generally speaking, has fallen apart. And this is what led to the postmodern turn. And so once we see the postmodern turn, now the general, and there's plenty of academics that are critical of this. I don't mean to say that everybody in the academy is a postmodernist. No, that's not what I'm saying. But what's referred to as the postmodern turn is the belief that we really don't know much about anything, and therefore everybody has their own truth, and everything has everybody has a valid interpretation of reality. And this leads to, like Michel Foucault, as I mentioned earlier, believe that the only thing that exists is power. And that totally aligns with a magical worldview where the only thing that really exists is power. And that's where I think that people have become more susceptible than ever before to magical spells, magical rituals, magical influence. And there's no transcendent mechanism in which people really have faith in. So because of that, the state becomes the sole authority. And that's where, again, when you look at this phenomenon of the NPC, I would argue much of what they would promote is about the authority and power of the state, and allowing the state to grow and expand and influence people more and more, leading to, whether a communist structure or socialist structure, doesn't really matter. I mean, capitalism ends the same point in which communism begins. So I'm not here to debate economic structures, but my point is people are so susceptible to these influences because they're living a life not based on logic, not based on reason, not based on objective morality. It's based on their own hedonistic desires, which again connects us back to the beginning point of magic, which is about the manifestation of will. And so people then are living lives in which the only thing that they're concerned with is the manifestation of their desires and their wills. Whether they're using magical practices to do that or not, they've already adopted the presuppositions and the worldview in which magic is efficacious.
Absolutely. I think this is very relevant to what's happening around us. And, you did speak about the presence of magic and sort of the relationship between humans and objects, right? And I think in relation to this particular assassin's bullet, right, I don't want to get back down to the news, but I think on a really, on a sort of a darker level, I think if we consider the week in which this has occurred, right? For Orthodox Christians, this is, of course, in the last 100 years plus, just a bit over a century. We've all been commemorating the royal Romanov martyrs who were ritually murdered, actually, in the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, actually tonight. Beginning from midnight on the 17th of July 1918, and in fact that was confirmed by the church to be a ritual murder. The saints have spoken about it. The various elders of the church have already confirmed it. And what's interesting is the active sort of magical properties relating to that murder. So one thing I think that a researcher and a Russian Orthodox historian actually brought up was the fact that a lot of the people speak about the use of bayonets and potentially even ritual stilettos in that murder in the house's basement. But what they don't really consider is the fact that even bullets themselves, right? Because if we think about historically, bullets, gunpowder, blacksmithing, right? The creation of weapons was always also related with the magical enchantment of objects. So blacksmithing, alchemy, chemistry, the creation of powder which lets you fire, manslaughtering elements at other humans, killing them. I think these were all interrelated. We see blacksmithing related to magic. We see it in video games, frankly, these days, but it's actually a real thing that went back to even ancient Egyptian times, and probably even, we can probably consider it as an element of even pre-flood culture, which somehow translated into today's world. But naturally, even the bullets probably used in the Ipatiev house, we do know that some of the murderers spoke about in their memoirs and various letters. They spoke about how Yakov Yurovsky, the really strange, questionable character who was in charge of the murder of the royal family, took everybody's guns and rifles away a few hours before the murder and then brought them back as if some sort of ritual was performed. This theory was brought around by Leonid Bolotin, a really famous Russian Orthodox historian who's still active today. But it's a very interesting relation because we do talk about this one particular sniper's bullet, one killing a father and two of them flying astray. It's not out of the realm of the ordinary to have even weapons in the modern world sort of enchanted. I mean, we in the Orthodox Church, we literally have weapons in a way blessed in order for the church and the grace of God to protect the people using the weapons to not be used in a negative light for maraudering and other things like that. So protect them from essentially demonic energies and the influence of demons. So it's a very interesting analogy, especially given this week. And I think it's curious you mentioned how the hatred that sort of Trump sort of pulled onto himself, right? Whether it was conscious or accidental, essentially, can you imagine the magnitude and the quantity of witches and all these Reddit sorcerers essentially typing up spells and reading out incantations against him, actually actively? I mean, we had entire Reddits dedicated to casting hexes and curses on Trump, which is not
Right.
a joke. And we have these
No.
hexes and curses being cast on people like Putin. And if you think about it, before the revolution, the most hated people in the entire Orthodox Christian world was, of course, the Russian Tsar, who eventually they ended up achieving their goals, and they eventually ritually murdered him and his family and his servants on this particular night. And it was all very sort of planned. And we see it today. Certain people, whenever they attract this collective hatred, it brings around certain very dark energies. And so, yes, when you speak about, you're completely right, Patrick, the obtaining and the channeling of collective hatred, it's definitely used in sort of magical terms and magical properties in order to achieve certain results. And of course, it's all demonic. There's no sort of, it's not the same as a mass of Christians attending a liturgy and praying, or praying for the soul of a reposed person. It's very different. And I think we see that presently it's very much active. And when you have somebody like Elon Musk bringing up Neuralink and how to interconnect many people into one sort of entity, into one sort of hive mind, or give them some sort of further interconnection beyond that which humans are naturally capable of, it brings around even sort of darker thoughts. I think it's a little bit scary. And do we even trust somebody like an Elon Musk with such power? I think this idea is coming up in a lot of Orthodox Christian heads at the moment.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to point out. First one, you were mentioning energy, and I want to make explicit that within magical practices, many, especially contemporary magicians, would argue that the most efficacious energy is the manipulation of sexual energy, and that if you're looking at man from a secular atheistic point of view, it's the sexual drive which it animates him to the most significant degree. And so when we look at our society and we look at the prevalence of sexual sin and various weird forms of sexual practice, we see essentially the normalization of pedophilia. Obviously, we've already normalized homosexuality, which is amazing because it wasn't even legalized in the United States, same-sex marriage, until 2014. So we're only 10 years, a decade after the legalization of gay marriage, and now we don't know what a woman is, i.e., the Supreme Court justice that wouldn't define what a woman was. And so sexual sin, sex itself, the manipulation of sexual energy is a key point. If you want to look at how people are being manipulated, look towards that. And so I would argue that our society is filled with occult influences and getting people to abase themselves through their sexual desires, which again dissolves that image of God within themselves through sin. That's what sin is. It's missing the mark. But as you miss the mark, it dissipates the energies of God within us, which is tied to theosis. So the more that you engage in sexual degeneracy, the darker your noetic faculties become. The darker you become as a person, the less uncreated energies of God, these energies that pre-exist creation itself, reason, love, logic, truth, mercy, compassion, honor, glory, the less you have those within you, the closer you are to death, right? In a really literal way. This is where, when scripture says sin is death, I mean, from an Orthodox standpoint, it makes total sense how it literally leads to death. So I just wanted to make that a point first when we look at contemporary society, is that the manipulation of sexual energies is a huge catalyst for the manifestation of their ultimate desire, which again, if we discussed that's about the dissolution of boundaries, if you looked at who's protesting and saying no border, no wall, no USA at all, I guarantee you there's a high quantity of people within that group that abase themselves through their sexual desires. And so what's happening is through the transgression of the moral boundaries, through their sexual activities, they, whether conscious or not, are moving towards this dissolution of all boundaries, which, again, as Orthodox Christians, this is what leads to the kingdom of the antichrist, the one world government. You can't have a one world government until you erode all the boundaries of nation states. And the way that you're going to do that, I mean, obviously mass immigration, but you're going to debase the population themselves. So that what boundary are they upholding? Really none. If you ask a transgender or somebody on the left, what boundaries can't be crossed, it'd be some type of social construction like social justice or intolerance of inclusivity of diverse peoples. This is intolerable. Well, all it is it's dissolving boundaries and creating a monolithic group. And so there's a term in Neoplatonism called henosis. And henosis is their conception of unity with God, which is again about the dissolution of all boundaries and moving back to pure unity. So there's a presupposition here, and I think Conrad mentioned earlier about like pure unity, and that what these magical practices are doing is that it's dissolving, as you said, the non-dialectical relationship in orthodoxy is that we have one and many. There is no tension between the one and the many, the ancient philosophical problem of the one and the many. But for these people, it really is about total unity. And so, yeah, you can be black, you can be white, you can be yellow. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just you have to adopt the same program. And so there's really no diversity. It's all about a submission to pure unity. That was one point I wanted to make. The second one was, you mentioned blacksmithing. And this actually connects to my research with transhumanism. Most people, wouldn't be able to draw a connection between how does transhumanism relate in any way to magic.
Thank you so much for listening to the free preview of the Aether Hour this week, everybody. We want to thank Patrick for coming on, providing this incredible analysis. Be sure to get behind the paywall, hear the full thing. There is some insanely deep stuff that you do not want to miss. This is one of our most in-depth, high-level episodes, so be sure to check it out. We're really, all three of us are tapped in on the same page, getting into some good stuff. We talk about magic, sigils, AI and the antichrist, World War III prophecies, all these sorts of things. A lot of stuff with Gnostic technology and things in that vein, so be sure to get behind the paywall, support the show, and thank you again so much for listening. We'll see you on the other side. God bless.